Welcome everyone to LR lesson number 14. It's been a while, I know, but it's not because I've stopped teaching. It's because actually the opposite. I've been pretty busy teaching, but this is something that I have come increasingly into contact with as I teach people in LR. And so I decided it's high time to share it with all of you. Today we'll be covering the 6 patterns of LR that I teach. Not an exclusive list, there might be more, but that's not really my concern here. So, as much as I hate teaching specific patterns on the exam, there are 6 patterns that I feel you guys should know. The first is correlation versus causation. Next, we go to relative versus absolute. After that, parts versus whole. And the fourth one, and perhaps the most famous one for most of you guys, is necessity versus sufficiency. After that, this fifth one here in my list is sort of proprietary to me. I call it the chosen champion issue. We'll discuss what exactly that actually is when we get to it. And finally, at the lower end of this list, for a reason, is the vocabulary discrepancy. So patterns 1 through 4, I call primary patterns because you should expect yourself as a student of this exam to be able to identify when any of the above are going on in a stimulus. And generally, if one of these primary patterns appears alongside pattern 5 or 6, although it's kind of rare for pattern 5 to be there, but it's possible. But whenever you see one of the primary patterns plus something else, the primary pattern takes precedence over whatever else you found. I also have no recollection personally of ever seeing a stimulus that has more than one of these primary patterns mixed into it. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. So either way, the primary patterns, whenever you do see one, they're non-negotiable. Can't just ignore them. You should expect yourself to be able to find them. And pattern number 5 arguably is just a specialized case of pattern number 4, necessity versus efficiency. But I do find that number 5, the chosen champion issue, it does help a lot of students navigate questions more reliably than always just reflexively falling back on necessity versus efficiency. And a note about pattern 6. It is a pattern, it's real, and it definitely works on easier questions, but you should always consider it the least important of all the logical patterns that we see in LR. It's there again, but it should be the last thing in terms of priority. And then this is kind of another sort of asterisk. I sort of alluded to this on the title slide, and I'll say it here again. There might be other valid patterns that other qualified instructors like to teach, but this list of 6, that's about the maximum extent of technique that I'm willing to teach myself. If you happen to know of other patterns that are not on this list that do also work for you, knock yourself out. This list is not making any judgment about other patterns that you see. These are simply the 6 that I tend I find myself going over with students again and again. All right, so let's start right up with the first one on the list, correlation versus causation. The basic idea behind this one is that the premises say that X happens. The premises also say that Y happens. The premises do not explicitly at any point tell us that X or Y contributes to the other one. The conclusion does explicitly claim that X or Y contributes to the other, or outright uses the word causes, even if they don't hedge their bets with contribute. So the thing is, you guys already know the pattern that I just outlined above. Why is it that you sometimes miss seeing correlation versus causation stimuli, or you get confused by it when you see it in an answer choice? Um, the first thing I'll start with is do not be on the lookout for this pattern, or really any of the other patterns, from the outset, unless it's incredibly obvious, unless they basically say this is going to be a correlation versus causation. Like, I don't really know how to generalize the most obvious way to do it, but sometimes it's more obvious than others. Don't ignore yourself if you just can't see past it, but at the same time, don't always be on the hunt for this sort of stuff immediately. Instead, if you notice causal or merely contributory language in the conclusion, that's your red flag. Go back to the premises and confirm whether or not such causal or contributory language actually is justified. So again, I don't really red flag most of this correlation versus causation stuff in a stimulus until I get to the conclusion, which invariably uses some variation of causing or contributing. And it's like, okay, I see causal stuff here. They're clearly saying that causation is a thing. Do the premises say that causation is a thing? So this part, the going back to the premises to confirm whether or not causal or contributory language is justified, that's where a lot of you guys struggle. Most of you are too willing to see causal or contributory data in the premises when it's not there, while some of you are too unforgiving in the other direction. But most of the time, it's the yellow thing. It's where um, you kind of just look at a sentence that just correlates things. It's just doing nothing other than telling you that X and Y are happening at the same time, or that they have been observed simultaneously, whatever it is. And you guys just assume causation out of that. No, no, that's the whole point of this. Learn to recognize when language is causal and when it is not in the premises. That's the key for you guys here. So there's plenty of questions with this pattern that I could bring up as an example, but since everyone's kryptonite regarding this issue is a little bit different, just email me about any specific question where you came up against correlation versus causation. You tried some of the things that I suggested here in terms of waiting until you got to inclusion to see the red flag, then going back and reassessing the premise language. You did that, still didn't work. I might be able to help you. Just not in an abstract context. I might need something more specific for you. So moving into the next pattern on the list, relative versus absolute, we'll again start with the basic idea behind it. There's two variations of relative versus absolute. The first is when we start with relative premises, and then we end up with absolute conclusions. And this is the most common, I think, manifestation of this pattern in LR. So the premises are going to say on some spectrum, entity X is higher slash lower than entity Y. The conclusion will then incorrectly assert that based on the premise that we can place either X or Y at some specified location on the spectrum. Of course, the problem with this is that we only know how X and Y compare to each other, not where X or Y actually is. Notice our premises don't tell us that. They just only tell us where X and Y are relative to each other, not where either one of them is. The second variation is just sort of the mirror opposite of this. It's where they improperly move from an absolute premise to a relative conclusion. And in my assessment, this seems less common, but I could be wrong about that. So feel free to fact check me on if you want to. But this at least seems to be less of an issue for you guys than the first one. The premise is very similar, but obviously it's opposite. X is at some specified location on a spectrum, and from that they conclude that we can place X higher or lower than thing Y. Of course, when I set it up like this, the problem should be obvious, right? The problem is we only know where X itself is, and we have no data about Y. We don't know how Y compares to it. So let me just give you an example because it can be a little confusing to see this in the abstract. Uh, so the premise for this hypothetical example is that proposal X meets 99.9% of our criteria. Um, and the conclusion based on that is therefore proposal X is the best option we have. So note that the premise has absolute data. We know how criteria fulfilling, how good it is on that sense. But do we know that it's better than our other options? We don't. But our conclusion does shift away from that absolute level to a better relative level. It puts X above, better than everything else that we have. So again, the problem is, what if there's a proposal Y out there, which is clearly not discussed, that hits the 100% mark, that actually exceeds X's absolute value? So when I lay it out like this, obviously, again, like I've been alluding to a couple times on this slide, it looks pretty simple. So how do you still miss this kind of stuff? Well, a bit unlike pattern number one, I do think that you should be able to track relative comparisons immediately. If you see this at the very beginning, and very often the first sentence of the first clause will contain relative data, treat that as your red flag for this issue. Uh, and now that you've been alerted to the presence of relative statements in the premises already, it should be more obvious to you when the conclusion improperly moves to absolute statements. So as for the other side of the coin, when it comes to um, starting with absolute premises and moving to a relative conclusion, it's that's just the exam hiding relative versus absolute patterns. The example I provided hopefully is enough to open your eyes to it because the interesting thing about the example that I gave is that even though the basic idea breakdown that I put again had pit x against y, and that's what we would think we naturally need for a relative versus absolute situation, but you can see in the example that I provided, there isn't explicit mention of y, right? There really isn't. Y is sort of what we figured out in the problem assumption analysis phase, right? All that the argument says is the premise of the inclusion. Proposal X sounds really good, therefore proposal X is the best option that we have. That doesn't actually pit it explicitly against other things. It's just implied that it's, that there's option Y, Z, W, and A, B, C out there. It's just that X is better than them all generically. So that's a reason that well not a reason, but that's why you guys may be missing relative versus absolute issues sometimes because the stimulus doesn't sound like a X versus Y comparison. They don't make it explicitly. Into the next one on the list, parts versus whole. Again, starting with the basic idea. There, like relative versus absolute, there's two subcategories of this. Improperly moving from group properties to individual properties. So in this variant, the premises tell us that group X collectively has property Z. And then the conclusion is that individual Y, being a member of group X, also has property Z. The mirror image of this is improperly moving from individual properties over to group properties. And this one is just, again, the reverse. Premises state that individual Y, who is a member of group X, has property Z. And the conclusion says every member of group X or group X collectively also has property Z. So I don't really have a red flag for you guys here, but I do see with students that a lot of problems can arise with the collective idea in the second variation. Specifically, when you move from group properties to individual properties, that collective idea that I've highlighted tends to be what gets you guys. So, in the heat of the moment, a lot of you get confused and ask, how is it possible that group X has property Z? Isn't that the same thing as saying that every member of X also has Z? And let me give you an example of why that's not the case. If I say my family, group X in this case, is filthy rich, property Z in this case, that is not the same as me saying I, as individual Y, am also filthy rich, property Z. It is possible for a group to have a collective property that is not applicable to each individual member. So yeah, don't assume that when they say group X has this property, that is not the same thing as them necessarily saying that every member of group X has that property. It is possible for groups to collectively have a property that individually nobody has, right? Moving along to the fourth pattern, necessity versus sufficiency. Again, this is kind of a big one. I'll try to refrain from being too pedantic about it here, but let me just go over the basics that matter. Um, so again, like patterns 2 and 3, this one also has two sort of mirror image subvariants. Now the first one is improperly treating a necessary condition like it is a sufficient condition. So this one, the premises will usually tell us that thing condition Y is a requirement for X outcome. The conclusion is, okay, therefore, because we have Y, we are guaranteed X outcome. Um, Now let's go to the other variant, which is the reverse, improperly treating a sufficient condition as if it is a necessary condition. So this one, the premise is X guarantees Y outcome. If Y, then X. The conclusion is going to be that X is also a requirement for Y outcome. There's a lot of reasons why many of you struggle with this, not the least of which is a lot of you guys have struggled with the sort of algebraic diagramming of it. That's a whole nother can of worms that we can discuss in a different context. But let me just kind of go over the sort of bare bones logical issues that you guys have. The first is don't immediately jump into diagramming just because you saw some specific buzzwords early on. I mean, you are probably correct when you see those buzzwords that there is formal logic going on, but in reality, you're likely better off identifying concepts that signal that one thing is required for another thing and use that as a red flag. So look out for language, look out for concepts, look out for patterns of language that highlight the concept of requirement. When there's requirement, which of course reflects necessity in the necessity versus sufficiency balance. But I think by and large, you guys have a much easier time detecting that rather than any other way. So use this as your in to necessity versus sufficiency. Other times, you correctly see formal logic linked to the stimulus, but there's maybe only one or two out of like a total 4 or 5 statements that you feel able to diagram. You see that there's a bunch of stuff going on, but you can really only diagram one or two of them with any confidence. In other words, you sense that there's a possibility of some sort of formal logic chain. You've seen those, right? They don't really do it that often anymore, but it used to be a staple of like late section questions where they'd give you like a big old chain of formal logic, except that there would be a gap or a break in that chain, and we would be responsible for identifying that break. But either way, there's the sort of chaining mechanism in the stimulus. And you're looking at this particular stimulus, and you feel like it's there, but you don't know how to construct or draw it. That's okay. Like in such scenarios, what you should do, you just diagram what little you do know. So yeah, great. There were five statements. You feel like you need to diagram them all, but you don't know how. You can only diagram one or two. Just diagram the one or two you know, and then that's fine. Let the answer choices then set you off on logic chaining journey. So even if you don't know how to chain things together in the stimulus on your own, there's a chance that by the time you get to the most promising answer choices, they will sort of initiate or add to the chain in their own little way, and then you'll be able to manipulate in the way that you need to. And so PT 151, Section 2, Question 22 is in recent memory one place where I had to resort to this methodology. Email me if you'd like to see, take a look at it first, obviously, and then email me if you'd like to see a video explanation on it if the tips that I talked about here don't really cut it for you. All right, so now that we've gone through the four primary patterns, let's hit my sort of proprietary one, the chosen champion syndrome. The basic idea here is the premise is set up X as a very promising option. It's saying lots of nice things about X. Um, and the conclusion just says X wins. We should choose X. X is the best, whatever it is. X wins, right? That's what they say. So, I mean, just looking at the setup here, it may seem like, well, I mean, it's obviously we don't know that X being promising is the same thing as X winning. Why even bother teaching it? I mean, there's a number of reasons. I did say earlier that arguably this is just a case of necessity versus sufficiency. More specifically, the conclusion pretends like X is sufficient when the premises usually fail to establish either necessity or sufficiency. The premises haven't done anything, but then the conclusion just pretends like it's a sufficient condition. That being said, though, this could also fit into any one of the other four primary patterns if we really worked at it. You might be recalling that there's the relative versus absolute um, example that I gave actually kind of sounds similar here, where we hear that um, we hear some absolute data about X, where X fits 99.9% of our criteria. That is an absolute measure. And then the conclusion just says X is the best. That's another way of saying X wins, right? We should choose X. And so that again is also a variation, arguably speaking, of the chosen champion syndrome. So it's not, even though I think it's most accurately looked at as a subset of necessity versus sufficiency, I think if we wanted to, we could fit this into any one of the other four patterns. So because that all of what I just said is the case, I do find it more helpful to see this as its own pattern. Um, so the reason why is that as the basic idea section says above, very often the chosen champion is presented favorably. And that's where the stimulus gets a lot of you guys. It just goes through a list of so many premises where all we hear about is why X seems to fit the bill. We want this out of whatever, and X is giving us exactly that, right? So we just hear sentence, clause after clause, sentence after sentence of why X seems to fit the bill. But of course, our problem is at the end of it, something sounds pretty good is not the same as we should go with that one, right? Just because something sounds pretty good doesn't mean that we necessarily know that it should win, that we should choose it. And that's something that you guys often just lose your grip on as a stimulus does what it does. Because you're very sensitive to the primary patterns at this point. You're not really seeing this as a pattern. You're just reading and nodding, and yeah, that's just what happens. It's just what happens. So the red flag for this pattern is when the conclusion just straight up picks a winner. Anytime a conclusion just advocates a certain choice, that's your cue to ask, really, bro? Is the discussion over? Are there really no other competitive options worth considering? These are questions that should immediately come up when the conclusion just says, okay, this wins. Like we should do this. That you should start asking these questions. And the yellow highlighted questions in the previous bullet point above should sound awfully familiar. These are the exact same things that I ask whenever I fall back on the general form of the assumption. I'm not really going to discuss the relationship of the general form of the assumption to this particular pattern. I feel like, again, that's giving these patterns more strength than they deserve. But uh, um, but yeah, I just wanted to highlight that similarity. And so hopefully by this point in the discussion, you're starting to hear a lot of sort of common threads. Is that your ability to access the sort of important logic behind a stimulus very often hinges on just really simple low IQ questions like this. Like, okay, you picked a winner, but did it actually win? All you've told me is that it's good, but is something being good doesn't mean that something wins. Like we know that's not the same thing. So a final note about this pattern is that I think it appears most commonly on strength and weaken questions, and so a strengthener is going to bring up these unmentioned competitors and then dismiss them, whereas weaken is going to mention these competitors and then present them in a light that is actually competitive with whatever chosen champion that there is. That being said, again, just like all the other ones, if you like maybe see this pattern or you're having trouble identifying it or you think you've identified it, but even after you've identified it, you've tried to incorporate these tips and nothing really works, email me, let me know, and I'd be more than happy to discuss it with you. And last and definitely least, we have in our list vocabulary discrepancies. Again, starting with the basic idea, the premises talk about thing X, the conclusion talks about thing Y. The assumption here is that everything the premises say about thing X also applies to thing Y for various reasons. Sometimes it's that X and Y are actually the same thing, but other times it's just that they're similar enough or they're in their same category to which the properties of X will also apply to Y, whatever the case may be. It's not exact. Beyond what I wrote outside of the parentheses, there's no exact size to this as far as I can tell. And there's really not a whole lot of important stuff to add here because this is one of the most basic Elmer patterns that all of us know. For easier questions, this pattern is often the one that they want you to see, and the correct answer choice will reflect it. But as soon as you have other logical issues, namely patterns 1 through 5 on your plate, vocabulary issues become the least important consideration. And most of you guys are pretty adept at detecting this issue in the stimulus, but you can actually add this like de-emphasis of vocabulary discrepancies, excuse me, to help you eliminate answer choice as well. So not just navigating the stimulus, but getting rid of answers. So there's sort of two ways to go about it. The first is if you're down to the last two answers and you don't like either of them, and one of them you don't like for a logical reason, and the other one you don't like for a vocabulary reason, the vocabulary issue is probably more forgivable than the logical one. If answer choice B says something logical that you're like, I don't really like the logic of what's being said there. That's that's probably a worse problem than, oh, I really wish answer choice E had used this word instead of this other one that they chose. That's probably more forgivable. On the flip side, conversely, if one of the answers speaks to a logical, in this scenario, you actually kind of like both answers. One of the answers mentions a logical issue that you found in the stimulus, and the other answer only highlights a vocabulary discrepancy that you found in the stimulus. Choose the answer that speaks to logic. So really, the long story short is logic trumps vocabulary every single time. It's so much more important than vocabulary. So as always, if you're trying this and you seem to have found an example where vocabulary did matter more than logic, if you feel like you found that, let me know. I'll email you, or no, let me know. Email me, and I'll email you back with some feedback on it for our review. So that brings us to the end. I do want to note a common theme to all the patterns. They all encourage you to see arguments as being made up of component concepts. This is often a great first step in learning how to genericize the language of a stimulus in order to helpfully simplify and clarify the logic at play. So, I I have quite a bit of content on this channel on how to sort of genericize and simplify RC. And of course, a lot of it consists of just not reading the majority of the passage. But either way, I do discuss fairly extensively how simple should be in RC. That was something that I've always struggled to do in LR. And even this video today isn't really doing a great job of it, but at least hopefully through the discussion of the patterns, you can see that if you can just sort of segment or break up LR stimuli into sort of concepts that are interacting with each other, that generally will help you do a lot and make a lot of headway in LR. So getting good at the first four patterns, that should greatly ease your LR journey. I do call them primary for a reason. They're that important. The fifth pattern is fairly useful. Like I said, it does appear quite often on more difficult strengthening and weakening arguments. But because it is a little less cut and dried and a little less well studied than the first four, you might need some guidance to really figure out how to make it work for you compared to the first four. I would like to pretend that when I say you might need some guidance, that could be other tutors, but frankly, I don't know anyone else who really teaches this particular one, so you're kind of stuck with me. But that being said, email me, reach out, and I'd be happy to elaborate in a specific situation if you need more explanation on that one. The sixth pattern is one we all know to the point. The point of including it here is that yes, we acknowledge that it is a pattern, but no, it does not trump any of the other logical patterns that you see. So I do also want to note that there are, of course, many stimuli that are difficult, or more accurately, not worth the effort to fit into any one of the six patterns. Um, don't treat this list, or any list really, as gospel. So there's plenty of questions that don't really fit into a nice, neat pattern. You do have to just kind of deal with them as they are, as their own little, terrible little unicorn. And I think the majority of questions do fall under one of these six patterns, but there are some that are difficult to fit there. So yeah, don't worry that you're looking at a stimulus and you don't really see any one of these six patterns or any other pattern that anyone else talked about. That's kind of the nature of the section. As always, thanks for being here. If you made it this far, this is my email address. Let me know if you have further questions. I've encouraged you at several points in this video to reach out, and I really do mean that. Um, these concepts, these patterns are simple, but there's more to it than just me telling you what they are. The real rubber meets the road when you're trying to apply this to practice and it is or is not working. That's where the real gains are made. So yeah, as always, my inbox is open to you. I'll see you guys in the next one.